This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Theodore Dalrymple Brexit and the ongoing saga of Brexit. Theodore Dalrymple is a frequent contributor to Law and Liberty. Many of our listeners will be longtime readers of his post for us. He is also the Dietrich Weissman Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. He is a retired physician who practiced in a British inner-city hospital and prison, a columnist for The Spectator of London. His most recent book is Admirable Evasions, How Psychology Undermines Morality, for which we did a podcast on this show. So, Theodore Dalrymple, glad to have you back on the program.
Well, thank you for asking me.
So, thinking about Brexit, we had this, and we're about a year removed from the Brexit vote, June 23rd, 2016. So that was obviously a shock to the system, a shock to the European Union, to British politics. No one really expected that outcome, even though the polls were close. Right up to the vote, no one thought that the Leave side would actually prevail, yet they did. In your mind, from that surprising event over the course of the past year, would have been some of the more surprising developments that have unfolded from the vote?
Do you mean in Britain or the world in
general?
Well,
take your pick, I guess. Maybe Britain. But I suppose you say that, and we could, some have said, Christopher Caldwell has said, that the Trump election isn't possible without Brexit having occurred.
Yes, well, that's a possibility, the idea that something should happen that is so completely against the received wisdom of what one might call the political caste and the intellectual caste. So that is surprising. I don't think there have been any great surprises since. I mean, one thing that does surprise me, rather, is that support for independence in Scotland has gone down rather than up. I don't know as a result of what, but many people thought that this would be the breakup of the British Union. But far from increasing a desire for independence in Scotland, it seems, at least for the moment, to have decreased it.
And this is not, the urging of the Scottish Nationalist Party and its leadership for yet a second referendum has not moved opinion in Scotland, you're arguing.
Well, on the contrary, people don't want a second referendum.
What do you attribute that to?
I suppose it's one has to look at the history of the Scots National Party. After all, it started off as an almost fascist party, and there are still fascistic elements about it. And I think maybe people in Scotland are drawing back from the idea that they don't want to live in a one-party state.
They don't want to live in, yeah. Do you think it's interesting, too, to think about what would Scotland's sort of social economic model be? I mean, a lot of people say they thought they would be Norway or, a country that would be heavily dependent on fossil fuels,
oil. I
think
it'd be more Venezuela.
Or Venezuela. That's
interesting. Venezuela without the oil. But, yes, I think it'd be more Venezuela because, of course, they are very keen on state control. They will allow private property, but it would be under strict control of the government. They want to interfere in personal life and private life. Not that the British government is immune from that desire either, but and they think that everything should be free. Really, their model is to have a subsidy from Mars, I think. And
but
and I think it probably has sunk in that there is no pot of gold at the end of this rainbow.
Yeah. Well, it's
and also, you see, I mean, if you think about it a little carefully. Actually, there's an opportunity here for an experiment. You could actually set up a border between England and Scotland and demand people's passports and so on, just as a foretaste of. And when you think about it, that's completely absurd. The other thing about the previous referendum was it was completely illegitimate in the sense that almost 1 million, I think it might be 750,000, but anywhere, a substantial number of Scots live in England, and they did not have the vote.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, and of course, they wouldn't be keen to give them the vote either, because they would almost certainly be very much against Scottish independence. And in other words, they're treating Scottishness like Hindu Brahmins used to think of going abroad. Once they left India, they'd lost caste. And I don't know whether they will get away with it the second time.
Interesting, though, in this regard, Northern Ireland has emerged.
Yeah.
It seems to me. I hear a lot of commentary I'm reading of a desire to reunify with Ireland in the wake of the Brexit and the ongoing, however the consequences fall or spill out. It seems to me that is a very live possibility. What do you say?
I don't think it's likely to happen, actually. What I hope would happen is that they keep the border open and foster as much smuggling as possible in both directions.
So why do you think it is not a live possibility?
Well, because I don't think the majority of the population will favor it.
Not immediately, but perhaps over time. That could happen.
Well, if they do, so much the better. I'm not sure the Southern Irish will be all that keen on it.
Okay. So thinking about overall the Brexit vote over the past year, what do you think major developments, things that it revealed about the United Kingdom that maybe if they weren't hidden, weren't as widely known, talked about?
Well, I think there's a very large, there's very large divisions within the society. It's a society that does seem, like many other societies, to be dividing into two, those who are doing very well and those who are not doing very well. And, of course, the people who are doing very well are for the status quo, and the ones who are not doing very well like a change almost in any direction. If you take the question, for example, and I face both ways on this, if you take the question of particularly East European immigration into Britain, there may be something like 1 million Poles working in Britain. And from the point of view of the middle classes, this is an excellent thing. They are very good workers. They're very good in services. They're very good builders and tradesmen and so on and so forth. And my dentist, for example, also is a Pole, a very nice man. And so the middle classes are very pleased with all this, at least as far as Poles, Hungarians, Czechs are concerned. But the working class is not so keen on it, because they see laborers and people coming from the East as competition. And we see the middle classes see them as better workers, have better manners, and so on and so forth. They're employed because they're superior, not because they're stealing jobs. So I think there's a division there.
You've said in some of your pieces in Law and Liberty that the Brexit vote, the Leave side, public opinion forming around Leave, in many cases was built on pathologies or problems attributed to the European Union that you said actually started at home. If I remember you correctly, you said a number of things are actually, endogenous to the United Kingdom, to its education, to its government, to its, bureaucratic issues, and what most needed to occur were changes at home. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's true. Anyone who thinks that leaving the European Union is by itself going to improve things enormously is deluding himself. There are huge problems in the country which have absolutely nothing to do with the European Union. Our bureaucracy is incompetent to the nth degree often, and this has nothing to do with the European Union. Our cultural and educational level is extremely low, and you can see this the moment you arrive in the country. In my opinion, I think it's perfectly obvious. And this, again, has nothing to do with being in the European Union, and coming out of the European Union isn't going to fix it. One of the people are very puzzled by the fact that we have great difficulty in increasing our productivity. I mean, no, it's not a British problem alone. Of course, you have it in America as well. And one of the problems, I think, is actually to get people to work in a highly intelligent and motivated way in Britain. Because if I describe the educational level, I think people would be shocked.
I mean, this sounds like something that Tocqueville would refer to as mores have changed. Mores have changed,
Yes.
But in America and in the United Kingdom, away from a middle-class bourgeois, tight work ethic, very meritocratic education standards. But it's interesting. I would argue, and I get your comment here. So, thinking about Theresa May and how she has addressed Brexit, and thinking about a speech that was widely commented on in our country to the Conservative Party conference, I think it was in November of last year. Yeah. And she sort of sounded these themes of nationalism, of the nation, of a sort of repairing damage or sort of mending things that had left that had frayed over the course of the last 25 years, and trying to bring more people along or bring people into a fabric that had excluded them or for which they had not been prepared. And she, I think what she was referring to there was globalism, and sort of this rift between maybe an upper third and a middle class and then a working class, but yet somehow there was this increasing sense that British society, two ships in the night, passing one another, and there was increasingly difficult where it had not been in the past for a working class denizen to move up. And it seems like she was trying to find ways to repair that. One of which was, reinstituting classical school education. She is a beneficiary of that in her formative years, and all sorts of these sorts of things that people of Charles Murray most famously coming apart, etc. And it seemed did Brexit sort of pull the Band-Aid off and reveal those fissures in a new way?
Yes, I mean in a broad sense, I think that's true. Of course, it's not true that no educated people voted for Brexit. That isn't true. And nor is it incidentally true that wisdom always goes with education. I mean, if you look at the history of the Nazi Party, for example, in Germany, twice as many students joined up as in the general population.
You're saying there was a real, after the Brexit vote, there was this sort of concerted campaign to say, the educated and the upwardly mobile had all voted Remain, and those who had been left behind. Yeah.
Well, those who left behind tended to vote out, but actually, interestingly, a large survey carried out of 12,000 people who had voted for Brexit. So this wasn't people who were promising to vote for it. These people actually had voted for it. Now, I can't honestly swear to the representative nature of this sample, but it was quite a large sample, and most of the people said that what they were most worried about in the European Union was the complete lack of accountability to anybody. Its complete lack of democracy, or not even democracy, any kind of control or check or balance in the whole institution. And I mean, it is rather ironic that someone like Mr. Juncker should accuse Mrs. May of a power grab when actually she's using a democratic means to improve her situation. But Mr. Juncker is not exactly a model of someone who's been voted into office.
It seems after Brexit, there's sort of a surge of interest in understanding the nation state again. Why do we have nation states? Are they
Well,
positively good in themselves? Roger Scruton, Pierre Menant have emerged as sort of leading intellectual thinkers in this regard. And in a way, when you read their writings, you can start to see how, in the midst of deepening class divisions, maybe slower economic growth than what most Western nations have been used to since World War II, these large welfare states, which do provide a lot of services for people, but which increasingly seem too expensive or worn out. And there's this question: so what are we about to begin with? And it seems that's where this idea of the nation and the democratic nation state is something that Brexit, it's almost like the British people instinctively, enough of them sort of instinctively realize, no, there's actually something good about this.
Well, I think it's been pointed out that you can't have a democracy without a demos. So unless there's some kind of feeling of being together that transcends differences between you, you can't really have a democracy. And there's a lot. I mean, a lot of opposition to the national state is because it is feared that the national state is necessarily nationalistic.
Yes.
So if, for example, you believe in your own nation, you must hate your neighbors and want to attack your neighbors, which is absurd. There was an interesting manifestation. I'm just writing about this. There was an exhibition of American art in London of the 1930s. And it was an interesting exhibition. And in the catalogue, the writers are completely unable to distinguish between a national feeling and a nationalist feeling, and even chauvinistic feeling and xenophobic feeling. So if you're talking about an American national style or American national subjects, actually what you're talking about is nationalism, xenophobia, and so on. And this is not so.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily so.
I mean,
it can be so, but it isn't necessarily so.
This is sort of the foundation, it seems to me, of the European Union, that democracy, nation states had failed Europe, and this is why one needs this transnational, I won't say governance of various bodies. Of course, as I say this, I recall taking an international business transactions class in law school and just trying to understand how the European Union works. That in itself takes some work. But think
a lifetime.
Yeah, and thinking about, instead of saying no, we had sort of a sickness, Nazism. Or we did have sort of in the late 19th, early 20th centuries this sickness of nationalism, but this is aggressive. It's without any sort of responsibility to the past. It's more about an asserting oneself and an ideology and using the nation state as a host. It seems to me, and this is sort of lost in the way we now, in the way in which the nation state has been demonized.
Yes, well, one of the arguments for which you hear over and over again for the European Union is that without it we would be at each other's throats. But the idea that Belgium would attack Greece or Portugal would attack Ireland or and so on and so forth is absolutely absurd. What we're really talking about is this is controlling the Germans, because the only people who are likely to invade, certainly in Western Europe, who are feared to invade and dominate and so on, are the Germans. It's a profoundly anti-German point, actually. It's saying the Germans are by nature a lot of militarists, and if we don't tie them up in a whole load of supranational bodies, they will be at it again in no time. And in some ways, of course, the Germans foster that idea themselves. They feel that they need to be tied up. But I actually don't fear the Germans in that sense. And the odd thing is, of course, they are becoming precisely what was feared they would become by being in this supranational organization. But in some ways, it's even worse because they're not, although they're very strong and by far the strongest, they're not strong enough to control it completely. And if, for example, when they talk about fiscal union and so on, if Spain, Italy, and France ganged up on Germany, they would be stronger than Germany. The idea of mutualizing the debt, you couldn't possibly have a better way of arousing German nationalism. So that argument is, in my view, completely false.
What do you think of the European Union? You've said, the United Kingdom and the way they handle the Brexit negotiations, they should seek to stay in for as long as possible, because there might not be anything left. You said that a year ago, I think. There might not be anything left to secede from. And now, coming out of that, my question to you is: do you see the European Union in an existential crisis, or is it still sort of successfully muddling through all of these sort of bad situations, some of which it's created, the migration crisis, the Greece debt crisis, et cetera?
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's muddling through, but if anybody wants to secede, it's existentially necessary for it to make life difficult for that country. So, for example, it is necessary for them to make Brexit a disaster for Britain. It's necessary for them, because if it isn't, let's say Britain just continues as it's been going on before, people will ask, and many people do ask, what is the whole thing for? Is it just to give people like, defunct politicians like Mr. Juncker and Barroso and Verhofstadt and all the others? Is it just to give them a job? Is it just to give them immense privileges? Is it a kind of sinking fund for failed politicians? We have Mr. Kinnock, for example. Who would have heard of Mr. Kinnock if he hadn't been? I mean, he's just a failed Labour politician. That's all he is, and he's done extremely well out of Europe. And there is this feeling, I think, not only in Britain. I mean, we mustn't think that being against the European Union is some kind of British disease.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is. Go ahead. There is something so off-putting, it seems to me, in the way in which the European Union deals with not only the United Kingdom, but also Hungary and also Poland. I mean, the two other nations obviously still in the European Union, and who have shown no signs of leaving, but yet questioning its authority, questioning strategy that it's using to deal with, say, the migration crisis. And the response of the European Union is so negative and so dismissive of it, and it sort of sparks to mind. It's like, do you not think that there's any element of self-government in the European Union? And then, with respect to the United Kingdom, it's almost like, it's almost like an East German component. How dare you leave? How dare you seek to leave? There's that element as well. Yeah.
Well, you can have any policy you like as long as it's ours. That seems to be the attitude. And of course, what is very odd about this is that their own policy hasn't been exactly a triumphant success. If you take Sweden, for example, which took 160,000 migrants out of pure moral grandiosity, in my view, it very soon closed the borders, so that there became there was a real border between Denmark and Sweden as a result of their policy. The
Schengen agreement, some have said, only works. It's only as strong as the weakest country or the weakest country's border in terms of facing out towards the world.
Yes. I mean, you have to have an external border if you're going to have the internal borders eliminated. I mean, I like, of course, I like the Schengen agreement when I'm on a train going from France to Belgium and the Netherlands or whatever, or getting on a plane from France to Spain, because it means you got rid of all that passport business. Although it's coming back. For obvious reasons. So they're not terribly brilliant at these kind of things. And of course, the euro itself was not a brilliant success. I mean, it was a catastrophe for Italy and not very good for Spain and so on. So,
thinking here about the European... Go ahead.
They want to dominate without being competent.
That's right. I mean, in this sort of, so the United Kingdom made a judgment that all of the benefits that come from being in the European Union, all of the potential likely short-term, medium-term disruptions that it will experience. Okay, so Mr. Dalrymple, thinking about Theresa May's speech this Wednesday, or that occurred 2 days ago, on May the 3rd, some are saying that this is sort of an attempt to change or influence opinion by pointing out the ways in which the European Union seems to have really stepped up its negotiating position against the United Kingdom and is really claiming a lot more concessions that have to be given by the UK before any sort of talks about, Britain's post membership relationship, how that will be structured, could occur. And she did it at number 10. And she, invoked Britain and sort of the opposition it's facing from Europe. And it seems to me she was trying to recall certain symbols of the UK and its national patriotism and honor against these sorts of European interventions. What did you make of that speech? And overall, it seems that the European Union is being increasingly punitive in refusing to even consider, trade or those sorts of things before a lot of other things are negotiated up front.
Yeah, I think this is entirely predictable and expectable because, as I said, it is existentially necessary for the European Union that Brexit should be very expensive for Britain and possibly an economic disaster for it. Because if it isn't, then other countries might follow suit. Italy is teetering on the edge, actually, because a majority of Italians want to leave the euro, for example. So it is necessary. I don't think there's anything at all surprising about the European position, and I would have been very surprised if it had been otherwise.
I don't find it surprising. I find the way in which sort of the political clumsiness, and maybe that comes from the fact that they really aren't political. They are command and control. But she calls this election to increase her power, her strength, and her ability to negotiate with them. And they seek to interfere. It does look like they're trying to interfere in the ways in which they're handling the United Kingdom, which could only backfire against them and leave her with an even stronger negotiating hand. Or even.
Yes, I mean.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah. I mean, it reminds me a bit of Mr. Obama's.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he thought that what he said would strengthen the Remain campaign, and actually it might have been one of the decisive factors that made it lose.
Yeah, no, I've read that. So the European Union, they're increased with the Brexit bill, so honor past spending pledges, which one can see that to a point. But from what I'm reading, they want to increase the amount that the UK owes, or insist upon the full bill being paid, even though the UK would not even be in the European Union, thus deriving any benefit from this sort of spending. And then you've got the claim that the European Court of Justice would still be enforcing rights in the United Kingdom well after the formal leaving of Britain, which would be hard to stomach, I think, because so much of this is about reclaiming sovereignty.
Yes. Well, I think I don't actually know what they would do if Mrs. May just said, well, we're not having any of it. What are they going to do? Invade?
They have no army.
They can't stop. They have no army, and they have no means of enforcing it. And if they they can't really start Napoleon's continental blockade, the continental system. They have to trade with us, actually, and it's in their interest to trade with us. So I'm not sure that their hand is quite as strong as they think it is.
No, the UK negotiator said no Brexit deal would be better than a bad one. Recently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's interesting
too.
Yeah,
say we're not paying. We don't recognise your law, and that's it.
Yeah.
And what can they do?
And they would have to trade with the UK under the WTO rules.
Yes. Well, of course they might not. They, of course, can find all kinds of ways of non-tariff and ways of interfering. But, of course, I don't know whether they would be prepared to actually to wage a trade war.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, too. I mean, you talk about the European Union, and, of course, it's not surprising they want to make this as punitive as possible, and yet there's a lot of trade with the United Kingdom.
Yes. And, of course, it's in the European Union's favour. Of course, it is true that a much larger proportion of UK trade goes to Europe than Europe trade goes to the UK. Nevertheless, Britain has a trade deficit with the EU. And if they want, for example, to destroy the currency, that's one way they threaten to punish us. It just means that our ability to import their goods would decline.
Yes.
German manufacturers wouldn't be very pleased about that. I think Britain is something like the second largest importer of German cars in the world, or second or third. So the German manufacturers are not going to be very pleased with that, and of course they're very powerful in Germany. So I think that if they are prepared to do that, that actually would be a sign of their desperation rather than a sign of their strength.
So, and I suppose we've been discussing this already, but let me ask you directly. I mean, what, if anything, have European Union leaders learned? It seems they've learned nothing and have forgotten nothing. No sense from what I'm reading. No real sense of humility, at least publicly, and increasingly not from Angela Merkel with some of her public statements in the past few weeks.
Yeah. Yes. No, they don't. They don't learn anything, and they act as if they themselves at home are 98% secure.
Yeah,
but they have enormous majorities, and there's a very firm feeling in favor of Europe in all countries. And this is not so. I mean, if you just take the latest French election, 40% of the electorate voted for parties which were of the left and of the right, which were much more anti-European than the Brexiteers. So, and if you read, for example, Monsieur Mélenchon's book, I don't know whether you read it on Germany. Well, he's talking. I mean, you'd think it was written just after the Franco-Prussian War, and so the idea
no small thing that
it's all going swimmingly, and we all love one another, and everyone is united against Britain, I'm afraid, is not true. And I don't know what's going to happen in the forthcoming Italian elections, but at the last count that I saw anyway, Five Star has an 8% lead over Mr. Renzi. So
I mean, it's interesting just thinking of the upcoming French election. Well, I think it's May 9th.
Yes,
and so we're talking before the outcome, but 40%. Just before I came on to our interview today, 40% it looks like Le Pen will garner in this election. That's astounding from one measure of where French is in this regard, and so. If they're, one part of the pillar of the European Union, yet they have this much unrest, and there is an incredible division from what I'm reading within French society, and this also we're coming to terms with this. It seems kind of, various Western democracies, America included, coming to terms with a economic, social, political bargain that hasn't worked. I suppose maybe one part of that is low-cost labor, incredibly efficient economically, but producing political consequences you can't handle, it seems, or difficult to handle.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, France is a very divided country. I think in some ways less divided than Britain. But certainly there's a division between those who do well and those who don't. And of course, they are the very conservative people who will vote for Macron. So maybe 60% are doing very well, but 40% are very, very unsatisfied. Just before I came back to Britain, I was in France, and I had two very similar conversations with people. One was a forester who had come to cut down some trees on the land around my house, and he said that he had worked for 40 years. He paid his taxes for 40 years, and at the end of his career, he was going to get a pension which was identical to someone who had never worked in his life. Now, I don't know how many people he knew who had never worked in their lives, but it's a sign of dissatisfaction. I had exactly the same conversation with a Vietnamese taxi driver in Paris who worked for 40 years and said exactly the same thing. And there is this feeling by people who are trying to run a small business or try and live independently that they are being exploited by the state. And this is a dangerous feeling, because the idea that nothing can get any worse is usually wrong.
Yeah.
Something can always get worse, or almost always get worse. But there's a great deal of discontent of that nature in France.
Interesting. I mean, so European Union, I mean, if you were, 2009, 2010, we had the Greece debt crises and ongoing saga there. And it seems the European Union, at least publicly, is weathering that storm. And then we had the migration crisis starting, I don't know, maybe 2014, 2015. And that really was a huge problem for European authorities to manage, particularly Germany, which Merkel obviously had sort of set the stage for that by saying she would accept anyone. And other problems, the birth rate obviously is below replacement level in most European countries. Huge debt levels in most European countries, aging populations. And so I think that it couldn't get worse. It seems to me it could easily get worse. There's just sort of a mild, I don't know, muddling through, as I earlier alluded to, that's just happening right now. And it may be the case that the United Kingdom is really leaving a sinking ship. We just haven't yet realized it.
Well, it might be leaving a sinking ship, but it's perfectly capable of sinking itself. Because I'm afraid the level of governmental and other incompetence in the country is very high and will remain very high even outside the European Union.
Well, it seems to me there was this argument during the campaign, during the Brexit campaign, Leave versus Remain, and maybe this was optimistic thinking that the United Kingdom would become like Singapore or Taiwan, not Taiwan, but Hong Kong, and would become sort of a free market paradise, and would really have these low tax rates and low labor regs and all of that, and there is no appetite for that in the United Kingdom. And from what I'm seeing from Theresa May, it's actually a willingness to increase state expenditures and certain standards, and it's political opportunism on her part, because the Labour Party has really lost itself. And so she can capitalize on some of their voters. But it seems to me where Britain will go after Brexit is, we don't know. It could be a sinking ship, yes.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it will just be a European Union on a smaller scale. But the fact is that it would, I suppose, be slightly easier to reform it than if it were not independent. Just to take, I've been thinking recently about the contrast between Britain and France. France is a much better administered country than Britain. Yes. It's partly that is because intelligent and educated people want to go into the government, whereas in Britain it's only really if you can't do anything else that you go into the government or governmental bureaucracies. French labour is much, much more efficient than British labour, and you see that in everyday life. And part of the reason I've been thinking about this. I'm not an economist, so I don't know whether there's any justification for this. But the very difficulty of sacking someone in France means that employers, when they do have to employ people. When they do employ people, they're careful and they try and train them to make them more efficient. Whereas in Britain, the idea is that you pay them as little as possible, and if they don't like it, you just get somebody else. So the French, in a sense, have settled for 10% unemployment rates. We have about half that as an unemployment rate. But the difference between those who are employed in Britain and those who are employed in France is very, very striking. The level of intelligence, the level of dedication, and so on in France is very much higher than in Britain.
Your assessment.
And that's a big problem.
Yeah,
that's a big problem for us.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that, because it seems the Thatcherite solution or Thatcherite program did it accomplish everything in this regard in terms of getting labor right, lowering taxes, moving the economy forward, and then obviously that led to Tony Blair and a new kind of labor, and then now we see this. I'm not really sure how to think about Theresa May. I'd love to get your assessment of her here. From what I see, she's been given both a tremendous problem, that is, Brexit, negotiating Brexit, removing Britain, but then also an opportunity of labor imploding, the Labour Party imploding, which she didn't make happen, but yet she seems to be willing to make the most of it politically and with her policies and the ways in which she's appealing to a lot of old Labour voters who maybe don't fit into what the party has become.
Yes, I think that's true. I don't actually view it as entirely a good thing, of course, because in a democracy you need a strong opposition, and we don't have a strong opposition. And also, I think one must always remember that the whirligig of time brings in its revenges. And one must remember that in the United States. So when people say that Mr. Trump is tackling or pushing back political correctness, what I think is quite likely is in the end he's going to increase it rather than decrease it, because there will be a reaction against him.
Yes.
And when it comes, it will be a very strong reaction.
No, thinking about the opposition parties in the United Kingdom. So the Labour Party's strength is likely to decrease in the upcoming election. With the Scottish Nationalist Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, in a way, Britain has turned into a multi-party democracy.
Yes, without proportional representation. So if you take Scotland, for example, they got. I think they have something like 58 seats in the House of Commons, and 56 of them, or 55 of them, were Scots nationalists, Scots National Party, because we have a first-past-the-post system. But it wasn't representative at all of the vote in Scotland, where they got less than 50% of the vote. So more than 50% of the people were not represented in Parliament. Now, our system of first past the post is fine if you have only two parties, but it's not so good if you've got 4 or 5 parties.
Yeah, but interesting, though, the Conservative Party is held together. I mean, the UKIP would have been the biggest splinter, but UKIP seems to be diminishing rapidly from what I'm reading.
Yes, yes.
Its accomplice achieved. So, uh, yeah, conservative seems
That,
to be becoming like the national party of England or the United Kingdom.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Except that, of course, it isn't really conservative at all in any
No.
obvious sense.
No.
So it has the name conservative, but it isn't really conservative.
How would you describe it, or how would you talk about it?
I would say it's a corporatist opportunist party.
Okay. Well, okay.
But maybe all parties in the Western world are like that now. I don't know.
Yeah. No, interesting. I mean, it seems to be the certain elements of the party, maybe more classical liberal libertarian, really didn't contend for leadership after the Brexit vote, or they pulled out. And I wonder with May and sort of, but also the realization, it seems to me, there's even in America, there's less of a desire for small government than ever. I mean, when I'm thinking about how healthcare has evolved, now we're in the situation where public opinion in America does not think anyone should go without health insurance. I mean, and that was never the case in my lifetime up until recently. I think that's Obamacare and all of these sorts of things. And I wonder, too, if it's faltering economic growth, a sense amongst so many that things really aren't going to get better for them. So you might as well hunker down and try and get as much as you can from various public programs.
Yes, always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse.
Yes. Yeah.
I think there's a large element of that, and of course there's also a kind of bloody-mindedness that, okay, it may not be very good, but at least nobody's better off than you. So
That's true, too.
I think there's that element to it. I read the New England Journal of medicine regularly, and I must say that reading its political opinions is like reading Pravda, really. I mean, certainly there's I don't mind people having an opinion, but I can't believe that the whole of the medical profession in America is of one opinion about these things, and yet there never appears a single dissenting voice.
No, this is funny. I just heard Ryszard Legutko speak, the Polish politician and philosopher. I think he's now the deputy speaker of the Polish parliament. And interesting hearing him talk about the way liberal democracy is practiced. He's talking about primarily in Europe, but you see this in America too. This notion that there is something intensely ideological about the ways in which opinions can be formed, and there's no room in the mainstream institutions or elite institutions for what you and I might think of as conservative, or they would say reactionary opinions. Legutko, his evidence for this is he was a bad guy when Poland was communist, and then when it became free, he instantly becomes a bad guy. According to the liberals, according to the parties that move in and take over Poland, instantly people like him are branded also as bad guys. He said, and this sort of in a way you see this. I mean, I think he's probably right overall in how liberal democracy gets practiced.
Well, I think it's increasingly like that. Maybe I'm just an old man now, looking back and saying, oh, it was much better earlier. But I think the virulence of opinion has increased. And I think, as far as I understand it in America, Republicans can hardly bear to be in the same room as Democrats and vice versa. And you can't have a dinner party in which you've got a Democrat and a Republican.
I am sure that is true in Washington. I'm living
it's not true elsewhere.
Living here in the Midwest and flyover country. I don't think that is necessarily the case. Certainly as you move around America, if you're in a college city, college town, certain parts, in wealthy cities or wealthy parts of certain cities, it does seem to be monolithically progressive left wing, but it's a different kind of left wing too. I mean, this is, I guess we're out of time almost, but we could talk about what does left and right really mean now when you have people on the left firmly at home with capital, and people on the right firmly
at home with their
supporting-
own capital.
Yeah, and people on the
They're at home
right
with their own capital.
Yeah, but it's interesting to think about Macron, supported by many members of the center left, many members of the center right, converging around a lot of ideas. And while people who would be considered, I think in a more traditional sense, conservative, not at home with Macron, not at home, people who love, say, the church, the nation, hierarchy, tradition, all these sorts of things, feeling very much left out by a candidate like Macron.
Yes. But there,
same thing with Trump in America. Same sort of dynamic, I think, played out in larger scale.
Yes. Yes, there's a kind of decreasing. I think there's a decreasing electorate for a nuanced conservatism, which values freedom, but also recognizes that there are cultural attributes that there must be for freedom to be exercised.
Yes.
I don't think this is. Unfortunately, this is not an idea that can be spread in 15 seconds.
No.
Which is what is given to candidates on television and so forth.
Theodore Dalrymple, thank you so much for your time today and talking to us about Brexit. 1 year later. We appreciate all of your writing for us and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you very much.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.